Something bad is happening in our tunnel house, and today I am getting to the bottom of it. Intermittently, over the years, we've had issues with manure that have been contaminated by persistent broadleaf herbicide residue. Unfortunately, this can last in the soil for a really long time and can affect the growth of a lot of different plants. Usually, it's my poor tomatoes that show the effects, but it can also affect peppers, cucurbits like pumpkins and cucumbers, and beans and brassicas like cabbage and cauliflower as well. They are so potent in such small quantities that as much as half a teaspoon in the size of an Olympic swimming pool, which is 1 part per billion, is enough to upset and ruin the growth of a plant. And unfortunately, I've managed to get my brand new tunnel house contaminated somehow. The way these persistent herbicides work is they mimic the hormone that plants usually produce called auxin, and this is the hormone that is responsible for the cell stacking. So it's how the plants actually grow, how fast they grow, how much they grow, and what shape they grow in. Now these herbicides are used in paddocks and fields, particularly in hay fields, to kill the plants in the hay that they don't want there. But unfortunately these things are so persistent that they survive not only spraying on the grass and then being turned into hay, but also storage and being eaten, surviving right through the animal's digestive tract, and then is still effective at killing plants when they're in the manure. And then we're digging that manure into our garden and wondering why our plants are busted. So this is my new tunnel house. It's 100 square meters, or about 1,000 square feet, which is such a wonderful size growing space, and we were so careful not to contaminate it with anything. We've had issues in the past with our goat manure contaminating the gardens, so we were really careful not to bring any of that with us. Unfortunately, we've obviously brought something else with us that we're not sure what it is. We were even so careful to make sure we bought 13-year-old compost to make sure it didn't have any residuals in it. And yet somehow something has gone horribly wrong. But it's really weird in the tunnel house because it's some plants, but not all of them. Some varieties have been damaged, while others right next to them are clearly heavily affected, and then others are perfectly fine. These are some Roma tomatoes. They're a determinate variety, and I planted heaps of them, thankfully. These are also same Romas, same seeds, same seedling tray, same treatment, same care and everything, but these are clearly affected by something. So a bit of history. When we were preparing the ground here, we bought over many bags of manure and bedding from our animal sheds, and we dug it through to add some life, some micronutrients and some nutrition, but more specifically some life, some worms, some microbiota. This soil was so dead, and we dug through all the amendments that we had a soil test done by an organic company, and they recommended a particular recipe, so we dug that all through as well. And then we tilled through all this manure. We transported all this manure in old grain sacks, and each sack covered between 3/4 and 1 whole bay. And it appears that some of those bags were contaminated despite us being so careful. And when you look at the affected places, they seem to have these pine shavings and rabbit poo and a tiny little bit of residual hay. These are a potato leaf variety, and these ones are stuffed. That one's kind of a little bit weird, and this one's perfectly fine. And when you look over here, it also has the same bedding, the same hay, and the same rabbit poop. Now I can't be sure, but it's either the rabbit pellets that we bought and that the rabbits ate, or the person that we bought the hay off, when we asked if they had been sprayed with broadleaf and they said no, maybe they didn't know, maybe they did know, maybe they didn't understand exactly what the problem was going to be, but either way, we thought we bought clean hay. And maybe we did, maybe we didn't. Maybe some of the grain crops that were in the pellets had been sprayed. There's actually no way of knowing, but it definitely seems to be this rabbit manure bedding that seems to be the problem. The peppers seem to be affected in the same spots that the tomatoes are, but these onions are growing just fine. Although this pepper appears to be an anomaly, all the plants around it seem affected, and this one seems to be growing really well. Plants over here are struggling in a different way. I think this is from water. That is water. I don't want to touch it because it's gross. So much water. I noticed that these plants were actually struggling first, and I also noticed how wet it was. So I dug these holes just to keep an eye on the water table. But the upside to the holes is it also gives the water somewhere to accumulate, and also it exposes it more to the sun and the heat, so it evaporates that little bit faster. Despite the area that the tunnel house is built on looking really flat and level, it's actually not. There seems to be a divot over here on the other side of this wall, and it seems like the water seems to run from this side and this side and accumulates here. And I've managed to dig a trench, and the trench goes out, but because of the way the land slopes, it's not deep enough really, and I do need to do something about it. I think I'm gonna have to raise this ground up. I was really hoping that the gutters that we'd put on the tunnel house would help by diverting the rain, but as it turns out, I don't think the problem is what's running off the tunnel house so much as what's on the ground, and it just seems to be pooling here. Back to my contaminated soil. I've got 3 more bags of the same stuff, and I've had a rummage through it, and it's the same stuff. It's got little bits of hay and a little bits of bunny poo in it, so I'm not sure what I'm going to do with those, but I'm too scared to put them on my garden. The herb garden has got some of this manure in it, and I thought it had killed the sage, but it appears to be regrowing from the base, so I'm hoping that might just be transplant shock and that I haven't actually killed it with this manure. I also put some under these 3 pumpkins, and then I've topped it with my good compost, and I'm really hoping that this lot isn't contaminated, but time will tell. So far they're doing okay, except this one in the middle, which was hit by an extremely late frost that we got, and it's lost a couple of leaves, but it seems to be recovering in the middle. At the moment I think the roots are only growing in that compost, so we won't know until they get further down into the bedding underneath to see if it's going to affect the growth. And most of the manure that we've used in the actual vegetable garden was out of the hen houses, and so far so good. So where do we go from here? I'm really thankful that it seems to be limited to these smaller number areas, but I'm gonna have to do something about it to hurry up getting this stuff out of the ground, and I don't want to have to dig out each area and remove the soil, because that's where I've just paid to put all these fancy amendments in. So there are some ideas in literature that seem to be helping and seem to be working, and so I've written down a few of those, and we're going to try some of them. We can't do all of them, but I'm going to let you know what they all are, so you can look and see if you're affected by this, what remedies might work for you. The very first thing I'm going to do once I pull these out is plant a cover crop of some kind of grass. Now I'm not going to use like backyard grass or paddock grass because they can be a little bit too invasive. What I'm going to use is either oats or barley, something that I can get from the feed store that will grow. The upside to these plants, any of those grasses, are really good at accumulating this particular toxin in their leaves. They have some metabolic pathway that's able to tuck them away out of the way, so they seem to pull them out of the soil and store them in their leaves. So what I plan on doing is growing them until they're a good foot high, and then just ripping them all out and taking them outside somewhere. I may well take them even to the dump, because I don't know if I want it on my property. Now number 2 that's suggested is using either a clay like zeolite or some activated ground up charcoal. And for me that's too expensive to cover this huge area. If it was just in a couple of pots, I think I would consider this. But what I am going to do is we've been making some biochar, and it will work in the same way, especially if you can crush it up. Now the charcoal absorbs the toxins out of the soil and then stores them there like in the wee hidey holes, so the microorganisms that can break it down can slowly work on it over the years without it affecting the plants. So that's something I'm seriously considering. I have already started making some, and you can see some little piles of the biochar in between some of the tomato plants. I don't want to dig it in just yet as the tomato plants are still growing, because I don't want to disturb their little surface feeder roots. The next thing they suggest is diluting out some worm casting tea and spraying it around. Now the upside to that is it's full of microbiota that can help start digesting and breaking this stuff down. What I have discovered is that this really old compost that I bought, it's actually from an old pig and chicken farm, and the compost itself is about 13 years old. And when I look at it, it has all the textural properties of worm castings, and I think honestly, having been stored there for 13 years, that it has a really high worm casting count in it. This is what I have spread on all of my gardens on the tops, and so I'm hoping that that will work essentially in the same way, inoculating the soil with a boatload of good microorganisms. The next thing they suggest is using supplemental irrigation. They have found in studies that soils that are kept particularly moist and particularly warm that this stuff seems to break down a lot faster, which makes sense if you're relying on the microbiota to do the breaking down, because of course they need the moisture and they need the warmth to get their activity really going, and the more moist and the more warm it is with the more oxygen, the faster they're going to do it. So I have my fingers crossed that they will be super effective in my super soggy, nice and warm tunnel house, that this will break down quickly and get out. The next thing they suggest is removing the contaminated soil, and as I said before, I'm not keen on doing that, partly just because it's just going to be so much work, and partly because we have invested a fair amount of money in getting all these little micronutrients and stuff that we've added to the soil. And I honestly think that we can use nature and the sort of biota and the fungi and things to break it down, and that we should have good success fairly quickly. Another option, if you don't want to dig it out and you don't have time to wait, is you can build raised beds up. You need to make sure that there's enough depth from where the plant's roots are going to the contaminated soil so they're not meeting. If you're really nervous about it though, you could put some kind of weed mat barrier down under the raised beds and build and fill on top of that. But of course, when you're filling that, you've got to make sure you're not getting more contaminated soil. The next thing they suggest is tilling, which is quite surprising, but in a way it does make sense, because tilling the soil throws a whole lot of oxygen through there and really ramps up the microbiology processing for those first couple of weeks. We are traditionally a no-till sort of garden system. I prefer not to till it. In fact, we have only just bought a rototiller to help loosen up the super compacted soil to make these garden beds. But because the stuff is so compacted and we've been trying to dig this things through, we had already planned to till at the beginning of this season and at the end of the season before reverting completely to a no-till system. And the final thing that I will be relying on is some kind of fungal growth to help break it down. Fungi are amazing at taking toxic things and making them non-toxic. Thankfully, have an edible mushroom that is naturally growing in this compost. I have triple checked that it is edible with a couple of fungi harvesting groups, because I'm not the biggest mushroom nerd around. I do like them, but I'm not a big mushroom nerd yet. But it's definitely edible, but we don't want to eat it just yet, partly because it's growing on contaminated soil. So what I have done is taken the fruiting bodies that have started fruiting, zhuzhed them all up with some water and basically sprinkled them all over the whole tunnel house. And I'm hoping to inoculate that whole area with plenty of fungal network, and I hope that it will help break this stuff down. And while I would love my tunnel house to be growing me oyster mushrooms, which I prefer, at the moment I'm not going to be fighting this one that is already established and already growing and already comfortable enough to be fruiting. I'm not going to be fighting it with something that I'd prefer. I think what I'll actually end up doing is just inoculating some logs and keeping those outside somewhere instead. And most of these ideas I found joined together in one blog post from a place called deepgreenpermaculture.com. That's hard to say. I'll put a link to the article down below anyway, because I found it quite a useful resource. Have you come across this problem at your house? Have you got anything that works? Have you got any tips or tricks that you've found out that have worked? Or are you really struggling? Tell me about it in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts and ideas and hear about your journey as well. And when this weather clears up a little bit and the wind drops down, I want to do a full garden tour for you so you can see where we're at. I'm really excited with how some of the stuff is growing. Some things are a little disappointing, but overall it's doing really well. And if you want to find out how I've made my own seed raising mix to avoid this nonsense contamination, check it out over here. Thanks for joining me. I'll catch you in the next one.